The afternoon sun streamed through the airport windows as passengers crowded around Gate B-17, their faces showing a mix of frustration and exhaustion. Flight AC 347 was already running 2 hours behind schedule, and the crowd's patience was wearing thin. Among them stood Min Lee, though few would have guessed she was one of the aviation industry's most respected safety inspectors. It had been a long day for Min. She'd spent the morning conducting a surprise inspection at a neighboring airport, crawling through maintenance hangars and reviewing stacks of safety logs. Now, dressed in comfortable jeans and a simple blue sweater, she looked like any other tired traveler just wanting to get home. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the continued delay," a voice crackled over the intercom. "We're working to resolve a minor technical issue. We expect to begin boarding in approximately 20 minutes. The announcement was met with collective groans and eye rolls from the waiting crowd. Min checked her watch and sighed, thinking about the stack of reports she needed to review. She hadn't planned on this delay, but as someone who'd spent 20 years ensuring aircraft safety, she knew that every precaution was necessary. Better a delay than a risk, she always said. When boarding finally began, Min waited patiently in line with her economy class ticket. She could have pulled rank and requested priority boarding. Her credentials would have guaranteed that, but that wasn't her style. She preferred to observe how airlines handled their regular passengers, seeing things from their perspective. The flight attendants looked stressed as they scanned boarding passes, their professional smiles slightly strained. Min noticed little details that others might miss. How the lead attendant's hands shook slightly as she checked documents, the whispered conversations between crew members, the way the ground staff kept glancing toward the cockpit. As Min made her way down the aisle to her seat in row 23, she picked up snippets of passenger conversations. A businessman complained loudly about missing his connection. A young mother tried to calm her fussy toddler. Two elderly friends discussed whether they should have booked a different flight. Finding her seat by the wing, Min stored her small carry-on bag and settled in, pulling out some paperwork. She always chose seats near the wings when traveling unofficially. It was the best position to monitor an aircraft's performance. Years of experience had taught her to recognize every normal sound and vibration of a commercial airliner. The boarding process continued slowly, the cabin growing warmer as more passengers filed in. Min observed everything while appearing to focus on her documents, the crew's interactions, the efficiency of the boarding process, how well the airline's procedures were being followed. A flight attendant passed by, and Min overheard her talking to a colleague. "Captain's not happy about the delay. Says it's making his schedule tight for his next rotation." Min made a mental note of this. Crew stress and schedule pressure were factors she always considered in her safety assessments. As the last passengers boarded, Min felt a subtle vibration through the floor, different from the usual hum of auxiliary power. Her trained ear caught something in the sound of the left engine that seemed off. Not necessarily dangerous, but definitely worth noting. She'd investigated enough incidents to know that small anomalies could hint at bigger issues. Just then, the captain's voice came over the intercom, sounding terse and professional. "Cabin crew, prepare for departure." Min pulled out her phone to make a quick note about the engine sound before switching it to airplane mode. Little did she know, this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The plane sat at the gate longer than expected, that strange vibration from the left engine growing more noticeable. Most passengers were absorbed in their phones or magazines, but Min couldn't ignore what her years of experience were telling her. That sound wasn't right. It had the same pattern she'd heard in 3 different incident investigations over her career. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom again, this time with an edge of irritation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight technical delay. Our mechanics are checking something, but we should be on our way shortly." The collective sigh of frustration from the passengers filled the cabin. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The cabin grew warmer, and passengers started fanning themselves with safety cards. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, and the businessman from earlier loudly announced to nobody in particular that this was absolutely ridiculous. Min noticed the flight attendants huddled near the galley, speaking in hushed tones and glancing toward the cockpit. Their body language told her everything. Shoulders tense, forced smiles, quick nervous movements. Something was definitely wrong, but they were trying to keep passengers calm. The young flight attendant, whose name tag read Kim, passed by Min's seat checking that all tray tables were up. The engine sound suddenly peaked, followed by an unusual clunking noise. Min gently caught Kim's attention. "Excuse me," Min said quietly, careful not to alarm nearby passengers. "I couldn't help but notice the left engine's auxiliary power unit seems to be making an unusual sound. It might be worth having maintenance take a second look." Kim's eyes widened slightly, but before she could respond, the cockpit door burst open. Captain Rodriguez strode out, his face flushed and his captain's hat slightly askew. He clearly overheard Min's comment through the crew's communication system. "Who's the maintenance expert back here?" he demanded loudly, scanning the rows of seats. His voice carried that special kind of authority that some pilots develop over years of command, except now it was tinged with something else. Stress, frustration, pride. Several passengers looked up from their phones, sensing drama unfolding. Min remained calm, meeting the captain's gaze steadily. "I was just expressing a concern about." "Ma'am." Captain Rodriguez cut her off, walking down the aisle toward her seat. "I've been flying this aircraft type for 15 years. These engines make all sorts of normal sounds that might frighten an inexperienced passenger, but I can assure you everything is perfectly fine." The way he said "inexperienced passenger" dripped with condescension. A few passengers snickered, while others squirmed uncomfortably in their seats. Min noticed Kim, the flight attendant, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "With all due respect, Captain," Min began, keeping her voice level, "I'm simply suggesting." "No, with all due respect," he interrupted again, now standing right beside her seat. "I'm the one with the responsibility for this aircraft and these passengers. If you're nervous about flying, perhaps you should consider taking a train next time." More snickers from a few passengers, but others were starting to look uncomfortable with the captain's behavior. A older lady across the aisle shot Min a sympathetic look. The engine sound peaked again, louder this time, followed by that distinct clunking noise. Captain Rodriguez's eye twitched slightly. He'd heard it too, though he tried to hide his reaction. "Now, if we're done with the amateur mechanics session," he said loudly, clearly playing to his audience, "I'd like to get back to actually flying this plane. Unless anyone else here thinks they know better than a certified airline captain." Kim, who had been standing quietly nearby, suddenly stepped forward with wide eyes. She'd been staring at her tablet, where she'd been reviewing the passenger manifest. Her face had gone pale, and she was looking between Min and the captain with an expression of growing horror. Captain," she said quietly, trying to get his attention, but he was already turning away, dismissing the whole situation with a wave of his hand. What happened next would change everything, not just for this flight, but for Captain Rodriguez's entire career. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Captain Rodriguez stood in the aisle, his arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction on his face as he prepared to return to the cockpit. That's when Kim, the flight attendant, finally found her voice. "Captain," she said, this time loud enough to get his attention. "You really need to see this." She held out her tablet, her hand trembling slightly. "What is it now?" he snapped, turning back. His eyes scanned the screen, and the change in his expression was almost comical. The color drained from his face so quickly that a nearby passenger actually asked if he needed to sit down. There on the screen was Min's complete passenger profile. Senior Aviation Safety Inspector. 20 years of experience. Lead investigator on some of the industry's most significant safety cases. And most importantly, scheduled to conduct his airline's upcoming safety audit next month. The cabin had gone eerily quiet. Even the crying baby from earlier seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. The passengers who had been snickering earlier now sat perfectly still, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. Captain Rodriguez started, then stopped. For the first time, he really looked at Min, not as an annoying passenger, but as the aviation expert she was. She sat calmly in her seat, her expression professional but tired, like someone who had seen this kind of behavior far too many times before. As I was trying to explain, Min said quietly, pulling out her credentials, "That sound from the left engine is consistent with a mechanical issue I've encountered in 3 previous safety investigations. I thought you might want to know." A few gasps came from nearby passengers as they realized what was happening. Someone in the back whispered loudly, "Oh man, he really messed up." The businessman who had been complaining earlier suddenly became very interested in his shoes. Captain Rodriguez's face had now turned from white to red. He opened and closed his mouth several times, looking like a fish out of water. The gold stripes on his uniform sleeve, which had seemed so authoritative moments ago, now looked heavy on his arms. I apologize, Inspector," he finally managed to say, but his voice had lost all its previous swagger. "I should have." "Captain," Min interrupted gently, "right now, the engine is more important than apologies. That last sound was the 3rd warning signal. I strongly recommend having maintenance do another check." As if on cue, the engine made that clunking noise again, louder this time. Several passengers jumped in their seats. A look of realization crossed the captain's face. He knew she was right, and now he couldn't ignore it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice noticeably humbler, "we're going to have our maintenance team take another look at the engine. I apologize for any further delay this may cause." As he turned to head back to the cockpit, the same older lady who had given Min a sympathetic look earlier spoke up. "Well, I for one feel safer knowing we have someone so qualified looking out for us. Thank you, Inspector." Other passengers began nodding and murmuring in agreement. The mood in the cabin had shifted completely. Those who had laughed at the captain's earlier comments now looked embarrassed. A few people even started clapping quietly. Kim, the flight attendant, stayed behind as the captain retreated to the cockpit. "I'm so sorry about all this," she whispered to Min. "I should have checked the manifest sooner." Min just smiled kindly. "You did the right thing when you did see it. That's what matters." She glanced toward the cockpit, where Captain Rodriguez was now on the phone with maintenance. Sometimes people forget that safety isn't about rank or ego. It's about working together and listening to each other. The maintenance team arrived a few minutes later, and this time, they knew exactly what to look for. As they began their inspection, passengers around Min started asking her questions about her work, genuinely interested in learning more. What had started as a humiliating public scene had turned into an impromptu lesson about aviation safety and the importance of professional humility. Little did anyone know, this incident was far from over, and its ripple effects would be felt throughout the entire airline industry. The maintenance crew worked efficiently, their flashlights bobbing in the growing darkness outside the aircraft. Inside, the atmosphere had completely transformed. What had started as a tense situation had turned into something unexpected, a learning opportunity for everyone on board. Passengers near Min were listening intently as she explained various aspects of aviation safety in simple terms. "It's like taking your car to the mechanic," she was saying to a curious teenager. "Sometimes you hear a sound that just doesn't seem right. Maybe it's nothing, but it's always better to check." The intercom crackled to life, but this time it wasn't Captain Rodriguez's voice. It was the lead mechanic's. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've identified a mechanical issue that requires immediate attention. Unfortunately, this means we'll need to cancel this flight for your safety." A collective groan filled the cabin, but it was different from the frustrated sounds of earlier. There was understanding now, even appreciation. A businessman who had been complaining the loudest earlier turned to Min and said, "Better to find out now than at 30,000 feet." As passengers began gathering their belongings, the story of what had happened spread through the cabin like wildfire. Whispers about the safety inspector and the captain's mistake reached all the way to the back rows. Some passengers were already typing on their phones, no doubt sharing the story on social media. The ground crew began organizing hotel accommodations for stranded passengers. Through the window, Min could see Captain Rodriguez in an intense discussion with the maintenance team. He kept glancing back at the cabin, his posture showing the weight of his earlier behavior. Kim, the flight attendant, was helping elderly passengers with their bags when she paused near Min's seat. "You won't believe this," she whispered, "but the mechanical issue you heard, it was exactly what you suspected. The maintenance crew said if we'd taken off." She left the sentence unfinished, but her expression said everything. As passengers filed out, many stopped to thank Min. A mother with 2 small children touched her arm and said, "My kids were scared of the funny noise, but I told them everything would be okay. I didn't know how right that would be, thanks to you." The last person to leave the plane was Captain Rodriguez. He stood at the front of the empty cabin, his captain's hat in his hands, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Min was gathering her papers when he approached her seat. "Inspector," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "In 20 years of flying, I've never been so wrong, or so ashamed." Min looked up from her papers, seeing not the arrogant captain from earlier, but a professional facing a harsh reality check. "The mechanic told me," he continued, "if we'd taken off." He swallowed hard. "Well, let's just say your experience saved more than just our schedule today." The cabin lights flickered, casting shadows across their faces. Through the windows, the sunset painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, a beautiful ending to a challenging day. "Captain," Min replied, standing to reach for her carry-on, "in my 20 years as an inspector, I've learned that the most dangerous phrase in aviation is 'I know better.' We all have something to learn from each other." He nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. As they walked toward the exit together, he asked quietly, "About next month's safety audit." "Today was about passenger safety, not personal vendettas," Min assured him. "The audit will be exactly what it should be, fair and professional." As they reached the jet bridge, Captain Rodriguez turned to her one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, "not just for catching the engine problem, but for teaching me a lesson I won't forget." What neither of them knew was that this incident would spark a chain of events that would change airline safety protocols forever. All because one person had the courage to speak up, and another learned to listen. Word spread through the airport like a summer wildfire. By the time Min reached the airline's customer service desk, 3 different gate agents were already discussing the incident in hushed tones. The story had taken on a life of its own. How a safety inspector in plain clothes had potentially prevented a serious incident, only to be publicly humiliated before being proven right. In the terminal, passengers from the canceled flight were clustering around charging stations and coffee shops, many still talking about what they'd witnessed. The teenager who had listened to Min's explanation earlier was animatedly telling his friends via video chat. It was like something out of a movie. The airline's ground staff had efficiently arranged hotel accommodations for everyone, but many passengers chose to stick around, hoping to get seats on other flights. The businessman who had been the loudest complainer earlier approached Min as she waited for her luggage to be unloaded. "I owe you an apology," he said, straightening his tie nervously. "I was one of the people who laughed when the captain... well, you know. I should have known better than to judge someone by appearances." Min smiled warmly. "We all make assumptions sometimes," she replied. "What matters is learning from them." Meanwhile, in the airline's operations office, things were moving quickly. The maintenance report confirmed exactly what Min had suspected: a potentially serious mechanical issue that could have caused problems mid-flight. The airline's safety director had already been notified, and an emergency meeting was being called. Kim, the flight attendant who had identified Min, was giving her statement to the chief purser. The really amazing thing, she said, was how she handled it all. She could have pulled rank right away, but she tried to help quietly first. And even after how the captain treated her, she stayed professional. The story reached the airline's social media team as passengers began posting about their experience. One passenger's tweet had already gone viral. Just witnessed a captain mock a passenger for raising safety concerns. Plot twist: she was a senior safety inspector. She was right about the engine too. #aviation #respect. In the hotel lobby, where many passengers were checking in, the older lady who had thanked Min on the plane was telling anyone who would listen, "That's the kind of person we need looking out for our safety. Someone who cares more about doing the right thing than being right." The maintenance crew chief finished his detailed report late into the night. His hands shook slightly as he typed the final lines. Initial warning signs exactly as identified by inspector. If flight had proceeded as scheduled, potential for serious in-flight complications within first hour. Back in her hotel room, Min sat at the desk, carefully writing her own report. She focused solely on the technical aspects: the engine sound, the maintenance findings, the safety implications. Not a word about the captain's behavior or the public confrontation. Her professionalism remained intact, even in private. Her phone buzzed with a message from her supervisor. "Heard about today. Board wants a full briefing tomorrow." This could change how we approach routine inspections. The night shift crews at the airport were already using the incident as a teaching moment. A ground crew supervisor was telling his team, "Remember, folks, anyone can spot a problem. Our job is to listen, not judge." In the hotel bar, a group of off-duty pilots discussed the day's events in hushed tones. "Could have been any of us," one said soberly. "Getting complacent is a pilot's worst enemy." As Min finally lay down to sleep, her phone buzzed one last time. It was an email from the airline's CEO. "Your professionalism today probably saved lives. We need to talk about implementing some changes. Are you free for a meeting next week?" She smiled, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments of courage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had proven something important. In aviation, as in life, real authority comes not from a uniform or a title, but from knowledge, experience, and the wisdom to use them right. The airline's corporate headquarters was buzzing with activity the following week. In a glass-walled conference room on the top floor, Min sat at a long table surrounded by airline executives, all eager to discuss what had become known internally as the Flight 347 incident. The airline's CEO, a former pilot himself, leaned forward in his chair. "What you've brought to light goes beyond one flight or one captain," he said, spreading out the various reports on the table. "We need to look at our entire safety culture." The viral social media posts had caught the attention of aviation journalists. Headlines appeared across industry websites. "Safety inspector in plain clothes spots critical engine issue." An airline incident sparks debate about professional humility in aviation. Captain Rodriguez had been temporarily grounded, standard procedure during any safety investigation. He spent his days in the simulator training center, running scenarios and, more importantly, thinking about what had happened. The flight attendant Kim had become something of a minor celebrity among the crew. "Trust your instincts," she told a group of trainees during their orientation. "If something seems wrong, speak up. It doesn't matter who raises the concern. What matters is passenger safety." In the maintenance hangar, engineers had turned the engine incident into a case study. "Look at these readings," the chief mechanic explained to his team, pointing at the data. The inspector caught this just by listening. Sometimes the most basic observations are the most important. The airline's training department was already revising their materials. "We're adding a new module," the head of training explained to Min. "It's about the dangers of authority bias, how expertise can come from unexpected places." A week after the incident, Min received an unexpected visitor in her office. It was the older lady from the flight who had tracked her down to share something important. "My granddaughter wants to become a pilot," she said, settling into a chair. "After watching you that day, I told her about how you handled everything. She said it showed her that standing up for what's right is more important than avoiding conflict." Meanwhile, the airline's safety review board was in session. The discussion wasn't just about engine inspections anymore. It was about communication, respect, and the courage to speak up. "We've had dozens of employees come forward since this happened," the head of Human Resources reported. "They're sharing concerns they've kept quiet about. It's like a dam has broken." In the crew break room, a new notice appeared on the bulletin board. "Safety first, ego last." Below it, someone had pinned a printout of the maintenance report from Flight 347, highlighting the section that confirmed Min's initial concerns. The airline's customer service department reported an unexpected trend. Passengers were asking about safety protocols more often, but not out of fear. They were genuinely interested in understanding how airlines maintain safety. Captain Rodriguez sent a formal letter to the airline's board of directors. "I request that my experience be used as a teaching example," he wrote. "Pride and presumption have no place in aviation safety." Min's phone kept buzzing with messages from other airlines, asking her to speak at their safety seminars. "Your experience," one message read, "reminds us that safety isn't about rank or uniform. It's about creating an environment where every voice matters." In the airport terminal, where it all began, something subtle had changed. Ground crew members were more visible, more engaged with passengers. Pilots stopped to chat with maintenance teams more often. Flight attendants seemed more confident about raising concerns. As Min prepared for her next inspection, she thought about how one moment of standing firm, despite humiliation, had created ripples throughout the industry. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. The story wasn't over. There was still the upcoming airline audit to consider, and more importantly, the lasting changes that needed to be implemented. But something fundamental had shifted in how people thought about aviation safety, all because of one flight that never left the ground. 3 months after the Flight 347 incident, the airline's main training center was hosting its annual safety summit. The auditorium was packed with pilots, crew members, and maintenance staff from airlines across the country. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as the CEO stepped up to the podium. "Today's keynote speakers need no introduction," he began, "but I'll give them one anyway. Please welcome our senior safety inspector and our most experienced captain, who together taught us an unforgettable lesson about safety, humility, and the courage to speak up." Min and Captain Rodriguez walked onto the stage together, a sight that caused a ripple of whispers through the audience. Many had heard the story, but few expected to see them presenting together. The captain spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. 3 months ago, I made the biggest mistake of my career," he began. "I let pride cloud my judgment and almost risked hundreds of lives because I couldn't accept that wisdom can come from unexpected places." In the audience, Kim, the flight attendant from that day, sat with a group of new crew members. She'd been promoted to lead trainer for the airline's new communication protocol program. The engine issue that day was serious, Min explained, showing technical diagrams on the screen behind her. But the bigger issue was about culture, about creating an environment where anyone, passenger, crew member, or ground staff, feels safe pointing out potential problems. The presentation included videos from that day's passengers. The businessman who had complained appeared on screen. "I learned that expertise doesn't always wear a uniform," he said. "Now when I fly, I pay attention differently. We all have a role in safety." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward again. The hardest part wasn't the temporary grounding or the investigation, he admitted. It was facing my own ego. Realizing that 20 years of experience means nothing if you're not willing to keep learning. In the back of the auditorium, the maintenance crew chief who had confirmed Min's concerns that day nodded in agreement. His team had implemented new inspection protocols based on what they learned from the incident. The changes we've seen in the past 3 months have been remarkable, Min continued. Reports of potential safety issues are up 60%. Not because there are more problems, but because people feel empowered to speak up. The presentation showed statistics. Response times to safety concerns had improved, crew satisfaction scores had risen, and passenger trust ratings were at an all-time high. A video played showing the older lady's granddaughter, now enrolled in flight school. What happened that day showed me what real leadership looks like, she said. It's not about having authority. It's about using it wisely. As the presentation concluded, something unexpected happened. Captain Rodriguez turned to Min in front of everyone. I never properly thanked you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just for catching the engine problem, but for showing me what true professionalism looks like. The audience stood and applauded, not just for the presentation, but for what it represented, a turning point in aviation safety culture. Afterward, in the hallway, a young maintenance worker approached Min. I spoke up about a safety concern last week, he said quietly. The pilots thanked me. That wouldn't have happened before your story. The day ended with a surprise announcement. The airline was launching a new safety initiative named Every Voice Matters. The program would ensure that safety concerns could be raised anonymously, and that every report would be taken seriously, regardless of its source. As Min packed up her presentation materials, she found a note on her podium. It was from Kim. Remember that day when I was scared to show the captain your credentials? Now I teach others to be brave. Thank you for showing us how. Outside, the sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors as planes took off and landed. Each one carried hundreds of lives, and now each one flew with a newer, stronger safety culture. All because one person had the courage to speak up, and another had the wisdom to listen and learn. The story of Flight 347 would be told for years to come, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a reminder that sometimes the biggest victories come from our most humbling moments. In the end, it wasn't just about one flight, one captain, or one inspector. It was about changing an entire industry's approach to safety, one voice at a time.